ever said something to you that seemed really innocent? It seemed actually just like a kind of an everyday question, but then was kind of somewhat judgmental. That happened to me once, actually many times. But this particular time, I'm going to tell you about, happened about 10 years ago. Before I started teaching academically, I used to go to different corporations. I used to go to like different places and put on like workshops, like communication workshops, gender workshops, all that kind of thing. And so I knew these people, but on a very, very casual level. I knew them very, very little. It was mostly just small talk. But we talked about, some pleasantries. And of course, the question, a woman had talked to me once, and we were just talking and just casually speaking, and she looked at me and she said, "So, what's your real job?" I looked at her and I said, "Well, this is my real job." And she's like, "No, you know what I mean. Like, what's your real job?" And I said, "Well, I go to different corporations and I set up camp and I host these like 2-hour, 3-hour, sometimes 8-hour events. Right? This is my real job. I teach you." And she's like, "Yeah, but like your real job, like something that you get paid for." And I said, "I assure you, your company is paying me to be here. This is my real job." Now, it's kind of part of life, right? People ask about jobs, and that word, that real job, what does that mean, right? Like, don't you, if you get paid for something, isn't that real? Then, kind of the conversation ended. And a little bit later, we were talking about the neighborhood that she lives in. And I said, "Oh my goodness," I said, "you live in Roscoe Village." I said, "I used to live in Roscoe Village." I said, "My husband and I, we actually just moved out of there." And she's like, "Oh, how come?" And I said, "Well, like our landlords were basically dying and the adult children didn't want to take over the house, and so we had to find a new apartment to rent." And she said, "Oh, how long were you there?" And I said, "Well, we were there for like 9 years." And she looked at me and said, "Wow, 9 years, that's a lot of money to waste." Now I don't really think, I said to her, I was like, "Well, I don't think renting an apartment is a waste of money. I had a roof over my head, right? I had a backyard, I had bedrooms and the kitchen and the whole thing. That's not a waste of my money. It gave me housing." And she's like, "Yeah, but that's a really long time to rent. It's kind of a waste of money that you could have just bought." And I said, "Well, my husband, I have no desire to own a home. None. Never have. My husband owned one with his first wife and doesn't care to own another one. So it works out great. I don't want to own a house. He doesn't want to own another house. It's great." But here it is now. First I was asked about my real job, and now I was talked about my housing. Now these are normal things that one talks about as you're having small talk. You talk about your job and you talk about, where you live. But I said, I was really happy renting. Conversation continues. This is all in a matter of 5 minutes, maybe. And of course, after you talk about your job and after you talk about the place that you live, the next question is always about family. And she looked at me and she said, "So, do you and your husband have kids? Do you and your husband have children?" And I said, "No," I said, "we decided not to have children." I said, "He is a son from a previous marriage, but we decided not to have children." And she looks at me, and "Can I just touch your arm?" She looks at me and says, "It's never too late." Now, I had just turned 40. I didn't feel like having a conversation with her that Chad and I talked for a good 10 years about if we were going to have children. I didn't have a discussion with her that we talked about adoption, IVF, and what if I had miscarriages? What if I couldn't conceive? I didn't talk to her about any of that because personally, it's none of her business. But she made this huge assumption that it's never too late. Now, I think about that a lot. I think about that conversation a lot, and it really, really bothered me. Extremely bothered me. Because here in a matter of a few minutes, this woman judged me on my job, on my housing, at my family, as if it wasn't good enough. And it really, really bothered me. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized, like, this one probably has a real job, aka 9 to 5, because that's what a lot of people think is a real job. Because I didn't have a 9 to 5, I still don't have a 9 to 5 job. She probably owns a house, I do not. And she probably has children, which I do not. Now, that doesn't make my life any less valid. My life is just as valid. But my life looks different than her life, and that's okay. But we as humans, we look for validation, right? We look for our lives and other lives, and it's like, well, you don't have that, maybe you should have that. And it's, no, I live my life and you can live your life. But I think about these 3 things, and as you navigate the world, you're gonna talk about all 3 of these things, especially if you're a woman. If you're a man, you'll definitely be talking about this. If you're a woman, you'll definitely be talking about family. This is part of everyday small talk. Now, that conversation really, really bothered me for a long time. But I decided that that just made me a little bit more aware of who I am and then how I talk to other people. So like when I go to a wedding, I don't go to my girlfriend and say, oh, when are you gonna have kids? That's none of my business. If someone gets a job, I don't ask them how much do they make. I don't ask them if it's their real job. I just have a conversation with them and I get to know them. Because everybody's life is valid and everybody's life is real. And just because it looks different, it doesn't make me less than. So in essence, while this extremely uncomfortable conversation, I decided to flip it and I decided to learn from it instead of being destroyed by it. Thank you.
I'll check the location, the setting,
Shh, guys, quiet, sit. Have you ever had somebody say something to you that seems kind of innocent? Seems just kind of everyday talk. But then there's a little bit of ick to it. There's a little bit of judgment to it. Before I started teaching academically, I did corporate events. I would go to different corporations and I would do workshops kind of similar to what we're doing here, what we're doing in the class, just not academically. I would go to these corporations and I would do activities about communication or about gender, and I would get people involved very similar to this. But so I was going to these places kind of regularly. I knew them, but I didn't know them. It was all very casual. And one time I'm just sort of chatting with just someone that worked for the company. And one day I'm chatting with her and she just casually says to me, so, what's your real job? And I said, well, this is my real job. And she's like, yeah, but you know what I'm talking about. Like, what's your real job? And I said, this is my real job. I come here to talk to you all. And she's like, something that like you get paid for. And I said, I assure you, your company is paying me to be here. Otherwise I wouldn't be here. So I just kind of moved on. It was a little like weird, but I just kind of moved on. And then we just kind of started talking about something else. We had just a little bit more of a casual conversation. And then I found out that she lived in the neighborhood of Roscoe Village. And I said, my husband and I moved out of Roscoe Village. I said, we were just there. And she's like, oh, how come you moved? And I said, because we were renting. And, I said, my landlords were basically dying and we had to go find a new place to rent. And she said, oh, how long were you there? And I said, we were there for like 9 years. And she's like, oh, 9 years. It's a lot of money to waste. I said, well, I don't really think it was a waste of money because I had a roof over my head and a home and a backyard and a kitchen and a bedroom and a living room and all of the comforts of home. So it wasn't a waste in my eyes. And she goes, oh, well, kind of a waste. The thing is, as you are approaching adulthood, which you are very young adults, these are the conversations that you're going to have. You're going to have conversations about your job and you're going to have conversations about your home. These are normal, everyday conversations. That's small talk that can sort of graduate into bigger talk, but it's kind of surface level stuff. It's to get to know somebody. Now, all of you are going to experience that, all of you, no matter the gender. But as a woman, you always get one more question. And the question that you always get is about your family. So we're chatting, you know, we talked about my job, we talked about my home, and then she goes, oh, do you and your husband have children? And I was 40 at the time. And I said to her, I said, oh, my husband has a son from a previous marriage, but we decided not to have children. And she looks at me and says, can I just touch your arm? So I said, we decided not to have children. And she looks at me and says, it's never too late. Now I was 40. I decided not to tell her my age. I decided that she doesn't know that Chad and I talked about children for 8 years, about whether or not we were going to have them. She doesn't know if I had a miscarriage. She doesn't know if we looked into adoption. She doesn't know if I tried to get pregnant and I couldn't. She doesn't know if I looked into IVF. She doesn't know any of that. And frankly, it's really none of her business. But the thing is, these are normal conversations. Not the judgment part, but the questioning of, you know, your job and your home and your family. Man, you're gonna talk about this all day long. But women, you're definitely gonna get this, for sure. And I thought about that, I thought about how, like, annoyed I was and how, like, upsetting it was that she said that to me. And the thing is, she didn't mean to come off judgmental. She just said it just to say it because she was making small talk. Now here's the deal, I don't know her, but chances are she probably has a real job, AKA 9 to 5. I don't, I still don't. She probably owns a home, right? I do not, and I'm okay with that. I don't want to own a home. And she probably has children, which I don't. Now, her life isn't any more than mine, mine isn't any less than hers. But that's the thing is about humans, is that we're always trying to kind of validate our life and validate our existence. We want to find other people that are like us. And I wasn't anything like hers, which is fine. She's not anything like me. But it doesn't make me less than. And it doesn't make her less than. And I think about that conversation about how it kind of destroyed me in that moment. And I decided to flip the script on it. And instead, I now use it like this, and I talk about it because I think it's important, and it changed me on how I talk to my friends and how I talk. Like when a friend of mine got married, I didn't immediately go to her and say, when are you gonna have a baby? Right? I let her just be married. I don't assume that people's lives are like mine. So it helped me open up my eyes to how I talk to other people. Thank you.